Hello, everybody, and welcome to the final episode of the Emphasis podcast series. We don't want to close the podcast series with a summary of the Emphasis project, just summarizing again all the results that we have discussed in the previous episodes, the methodologies, and so on. But we want to look ahead. We want to look at what comes after Emphasis and how the project's insights can shape the future of European agriculture. To guide us through this reflection, we are joined by Erwin Wouters, who is a senior researcher in the agricultural economics at the Flanders Research Institute for Agriculture, Fisheries and Food, ILVA. His expertise spans from economics, agricultural resilience, risk modeling, social psychological research, and much more. But especially, he is the coordinator of the Emphasis project. Erwin, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me and introducing me.
Well, let's dig into looking ahead of the Emphasis project. And let's start maybe discussing about how Emphasis results and insights can inform future policies, such as the CAP or the Green Deal or the Farm to Fork strategy.
Well, Davide, let me first say that the timing of our project is both challenging but also provides some opportunities. As you know, both the multi-annual financial framework of the European Union and the CAP is going through some reform nowadays. And of course, that makes it challenging because nobody knows exactly how the architecture of the multi-annual financial framework and the architecture of the CAP is going to look like in a couple of years. At the same time, it provides opportunities. It provides opportunities to have an impact at a crucial moment when the CAP is under reform, when a new CAP has to be designed. And with Emphasis, we believe we have a number of design principles that we can bring to policymakers. Design principles, not so much specific policy measures or policy instruments. Very often, policy recommendations from a research project are understood as recommendations on individual instruments that policymakers should implement. With Emphasis, our results are more in terms of design principles. In total, we have, for the moment, 8 design principles, and they have to do with principles that policymakers should comply with when designing new agricultural and food policies. One is, for instance, the systems perspective, realizing that farmers are not operating in a vacuum, they're operating in supply chains, in certain regions, in sectors with specific cultural, financial, economic, technological, biophysical challenges. And change towards sustainability will require taking into account all these different aspects. A systems perspective with policies recognizes that farmers should not be, or that agricultural policy actually should not just look at producers and what they produce in a vacuum. But farmers operate in a supply chain, in a region, with specificities, with local customs, with social boundaries, etc. A second principle that we have found in Emphasis is that future agricultural policies, they should have a strong commitment towards sustainability. That sounds trivial, but we have seen that this is, especially nowadays, perhaps not always the case. We have investigated the policy design space, kind of the policy-making arena in which new agricultural policies are designed, which we have conceptualized as being both the capacity and both the willingness. And we have seen that very often the capacity is much better than the willingness of policymakers to implement policies with a view towards sustainability. We see that the capacity in terms of budget, in terms of evidence available, in terms of administrative capacities, in terms of skilled people in policy departments is usually quite good or reasonably good, but that very often the willingness is lacking. So it sounds trivial, but we think it's very important to give the message to policymakers that a strong commitment towards sustainability is important. Another one is policymakers should develop capacities to anticipate and acknowledge long-term challenges and not just try to solve short-term problems. Farming is happening in a biological reality with changes. Climate change is coming upon us. So agricultural policy should develop or should invest even in developing anticipatory capacities at sectoral, at regional, national level, but also support individual farmers to develop these anticipatory capacities. We also think it's important as another design principle that agricultural policy has a lot of attention for three very important concepts that we have investigated in the project ENFASYS: coherence, consistency, and congruence. Coherence means that different policy objectives, that they are in line with each other and they do not contradict each other. Consistency has to do with the instruments, the different instruments that policymakers implement. Instruments could be contradicting each other, whereby one instrument is actually going into another direction than another instrument. We think it's very important that the whole instrument mix is quite consistent. And then a last level is called congruence, and congruence has to do with the level or the degree to which the instruments and the objectives together can support each other towards sustainability. Congruence very often has to do with the fine-tuning of the instruments, the specificities. It has to do with the stringency of the instruments. It has to do with the time sensitivity of the instruments, the flexibility. For instance, if it's instruments where farmers can get payments for providing ecosystem services, it can have to do with the conditions for which they can receive those payments, with the level of payments, with the duration, with the time specificities. And we see that there is still a lot to do there in making the policies congruent, more consistent, and more coherent. Of course, we know that it's almost inevitable that in a complex system as the European Union, with a lot of goals, a lot of objectives, potentially policy objectives might not be entirely coherent with each other. But nonetheless, we think that there is still a lot to do in terms of the consistency of the instruments implemented and the congruence with being the way in how the instruments are fine-tuned. Another design principle is being adaptive. We know that the European Union and also with its common agricultural policies, they have instruments in place to review policies, to review the objectives and to the extent to which the objectives are reached. There is normally a midterm review implemented, and it is our recommendation that these instruments, these possibilities are consistently implemented to adapt policies if certain objectives are not reached, to set new indicators, to develop new indicators. In that respect, we believe that the move from the FADN, Farm Accountancy Data Network, a data network collecting mostly indicators on the productive and financial performance of farms, is now going to be switched to a FSDN, Farm Sustainability Data Network, also encompassing a lot of indicators on the sustainability performance of farms. Another design principle is that we believe that policy should be developed in a participatory way with procedural justice. It's a term we have not invented the term in ENFASYS. It's a term that acknowledges that people that are affected by policies, they should be involved in the design of policies. So building policies that are reliable, building policy trust by involving different groups in policy making. It can reduce reactance, it can reduce resistance, it can also increase acceptance of uncertainty, which is inevitably there in agricultural policy, in doing agriculture. Doing agriculture involves taking into account the weather, working with living organisms, plants, animals. So there is evidently uncertainty involved in doing agriculture, and we believe that building more policy reliability, trust in policy departments and trust in the policy design process, and increasing transparency, increasing procedural justice in the design of the process can also help in achieving then the objectives. And last, we think that a last design principle is that in order to complete or at least accelerate the transition towards more sustainability, we think policies, they should take into account a fair sharing of risk, so that not all the risk of doing investments, of trying new ways of producing food is put upon the heads of the farmer, of the individual farmers, but also taking into account or including the entire supply chain up until the consumers. And we think that the transition towards more sustainability will inevitably include some risks for the people involved. And we think it's of paramount importance that the risks are fairly shared across the supply chain and not all put upon the heads of the individual farmers.
Thank you for really guiding us through the design principles, which to me sound quite challenging to implement, especially all at once, definitely. But I do understand that the more of them are implemented, the better the results and the better policy will be in the future. I have several questions for you that came up while talking. The first one is, how do you communicate these design principles to policymakers, and how do you ensure or try to ensure that these design principles are taken into account by policymakers?
Well, it's a good question. It's a difficult question to answer. Your question also had two levels. One is how to communicate these design principles to policymakers. There, I think, usual ways to communicate them through policy briefs, through policy events, or through targeted policy discussions where we as researchers directly interact with policymakers are a valuable way to do this. But I think it's really of paramount importance that while doing that, we can also explain the importance of what would happen if these design principles are not met, or what the value is of these design principles, that it can actually improve the effectiveness of policies, even improve the cost effectiveness of policies. That's something that policymakers usually are very fond of to hear, that complying with certain principles can also improve the cost effectiveness of their policies. So I think it's important not just to communicate the principles as such, but also the importance, why the principles are there. Your other question is how to ensure that these principles are met. That's an even more difficult one, because we know that policy making is a very complex process where policymakers have to take into account a lot of interests. Sometimes in research we call these vested interests. They have to take into account different interest groups. And then it might be it's not an easy task to make sure that these design principles are actually complied with. I think as a researcher, the best we can do is to communicate them, but not just communicate what the principles are, but also what the importance of the principles are, and how policies, and especially the effectiveness and cost effectiveness of policies, can be improved. But beyond that, it is to some extent out of our control as researchers, because we know the political decision-making process is quite complex. I'm quite happy in the EU we live in a very democratic, a rather democratic policy-making arena. But that means that policymakers have to take into account not just what researchers say. They cannot just technocratically take into account what researchers say and then just implement a policy. They have to take into account a lot of interests, a lot of concerns, a lot of different groups in society, from consumers to producers to everyone in between. And it is a difficult process, but I think as researchers we are able to communicate the principles and why we think they are important, then I think we have done a good job.
Okay, thank you. I have a few other complicated questions to answer for you on a few design principles that particularly catch my attention. I think they were all pretty challenging and they were all pretty impactful. But two things really catch my attention. The first one is the point of willingness and capacity. So policymakers have, let's say, a sufficient capacity for a new policy, or at least, let's say, satisfactory, let's say. On the other hand, the willingness, you were mentioning something such as we need to make sure that there is a strong commitment to sustainability. How can that be ensured? And in simple terms, what does that mean?
That is indeed a very difficult question. We have seen, especially very recently, in fact, let's go back a few years when we saw the call for the ENFASYS project. The whole call, it was breeding farm to fork with all of its targets related to fertilizer, climate change, antimicrobial use, pesticide use. And also when we were developing the proposal, when we were starting the proposal, starting the project, my apologies, farm to fork and the Green Deal was very much on top of policy discussions. It was kind of dominating a lot of policy debates in policy circles, but also in other circles, farmers' organizations, etc. But we are only a few years later, but we have seen an energy crisis. We have seen the war in Ukraine. We have seen several other developments. And we notice that even though sustainability is not necessarily absent from policy discussions, we have seen the narrative change a bit towards food security, towards competitiveness. Sometimes even words like self-sufficiency in Europe have been introduced. We know that this is to some extent also the result of quite a lot of lobbying. Interest groups that have lobbied, that might even have used geopolitical tensions, war in Ukraine, energy crisis, and other things to kind of change the narrative in policy circles from sustainability towards food security, towards what is actually the old narrative around the common agricultural policy, ensuring enough production in Europe to feed our population. Well, we think if that remains the narrative, then we can produce all the evidence on how to move towards more sustainability and how policies can support farmers to move towards more sustainability, which basically improves the capacity of policymakers in terms of them having the evidence on how to do that. But if the narrative is really not about sustainability, but about production, about competitiveness, about food security, then it will become a difficult story to have an impact with a project like ENFASYS and actually many more projects that have started around the same period, around the period that ENFASYS started. Many more projects started that were all breeding farm to fork and Green Deal and sustainability objectives and big ambitions in terms of improving the overall sustainability of the EU agri-food system. Well, we believe if the willingness is not there, it will become quite difficult to have an impact with the research we are doing.
Yeah, I think this is very clear, and it's a strong message. I think from the ENFASYS project, but in general from projects that are working in sustainability. Another design principle really attracted my attention, and it's when you were discussing about sharing the risks across the value chain, not only on the farmers, because I believe also that's what we were discussing in the episodes with the case study leaders, and understanding that sometimes farmers feel policies can be unfair towards them. Of course, sometimes it can be a feeling, sometimes it can be an objective view. But how can you, as a policymaker, try to share the risk across the value chain? Are there some, let's say, tools or methodologies that can allow you to do that? And generally speaking, when you cross this with the aspects that you were saying before of lobbying, but also simply of taking into account the interests of different groups in the value chain, how does this intertwine together?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and this is the last tough questions. I
you
promise.
combine a lot of aspects about the fair sharing of risks. Let me first say that farming, I mean, the primary production, producing food or of producing ingredients that will then be transformed into food, it is a very risky business. It works with living organisms, as I said earlier, with plants, with animals, even more risky. It is very prone to adverse weather, especially in not very controlled production environments. Of course, if you go into the very controlled greenhouse production environments, you can exclude the impact of weather to quite some degree. But it is a very risky business, and you actually see that along the supply chain. You see in many countries, actually most EU countries, there is in certain sectors there is quite some vertical integration whereby companies upstream of the farmers they're also involved in activities downstream of farmers, whereby big companies they produce the feed for animals, but they also slaughter the animals. cut the meat and package the meat. But what they don't do is the middle part, the farming, because it's too risky. That's not what they want to do. So of just that is a very very clear illustration of where typically the biggest risks are in the entire value chain of producing food. Now, how could this be? How could policies? It's a tough question. How policies could improve the fair sharing of risks? Of course, first of all, it could also mean that agricultural policy should not necessarily target farmers only. Agricultural policy. There have been calls to move from an agricultural policy to a food policy. And that's just a change of name, but actually it's more than a change of name. It suggests that we should move from policing farmers only and then leave the rest of the supply chain untargeted, unpoliced, but also have a food policy which also targets input suppliers, targets processors, even consumers, retail, etc. So that could be one way of supporting a more fair sharing of risks along the supply chain. Another one is that policymakers could, we think, do a lot in try to mobilize also private capital, stimulate the mobilization of private capital, whereby companies along the agri-food chain, they actually co-invest with policy, co-invest into the sustainability transition, thereby supporting farmers to make the necessary changes at farm level. Because, I mean, if we want to move to a more sustainable agri-food system, ultimately, something biophysically has to change at farm level. Ultimately, farmers will have to adapt how they produce food, how they raise animals. Ultimately, something has to change there. But that can be supported in many ways, also by involving or by mobilizing private capital.
Okay, as I said, I think we will now switch a bit topic because we discussed indeed the impact that ENFASYS may have on policies, but ENFASYS is also a very innovative project from a research and scientific point of view. So what do you think is the scientific legacy, or let's say the impact on the scientific community of the project?
Well, I think in ENFASYS we have set out with a very ambitious project whereby we wanted to, first of all, combine insights from a systems approach, looking into the food and farming systems, with a more behavioral approach, looking at the individual behavior of farmers, of consumers. Mostly, projects do one of both. Projects are either taking a systems approach or they're taking a more behavioral approach. We have we had the ambition and still have the ambition to combine insights from both approaches. But that means that we have developed methodologies which were not readily available in textbooks. We had to develop these methodologies ourselves from scratch, of course, building on what has already been done, nonetheless scientifically sound, but fit for purpose. Fit for a purpose which has not been done very often prior to our project. And I believe that many of the methodologies we developed, for instance, methodologies to develop behaviorally informed systems-based theories of change. These are methodologies that use a participatory approach, moreover, to develop actionable strategies and actions of what can be done to unlock farmers in the systems where they are to move towards more sustainability, taking into account both systemic lock-ins and more behavioral individual barriers. That has not been done before, and we have developed methodologies for this. We also have developed methodologies, for instance, for going from causal loop diagrams, which are techniques, tools to visualize and explain a system, how it works, to go from there to a quantitative system dynamic model with which you can experiment. What would happen if we push here? What would happen if we change this? That's also new methodologies, which I think will still have a legacy after. Well, I'm sure they still will have a legacy after ENFASYS. We will have a summer school, and there is a MOOC currently under development, which will stay available way beyond the lifetime of the ENFASYS project, so that future researchers can learn from our methodologies that we have developed. Well, in terms of the scientific legacy, I'm also thinking about the people themselves. Maybe first of all, the young people. Throughout ENFASYS, we have supported 6 PhD students and for the moment 10 master students. These will be people that will in the future have jobs in agri-food, be it in research, in policy making, in advocacy, or in agribusiness. So we believe the legacy will continue. These people have been trained in the systems thinking, in behavioral analysis, in combining both, in going beyond a diagnostic analysis, moving towards theories of change, that we don't just identify the problems, but can also identify leverage points, like where can we push to unlock the system. Another legacy is related to the people, is also not just the young people, but also the people involved. I'm quite sure that most of us will continue to spread the lessons we have learned in ENFASYS, and we think we should do. We will not just be willing to do, but we should do that. And the impact of ENFASYS is not just realized during the lifetime or during the lifetime plus 6 months of the project. The impact can even be realized years after the project. I will give you one very illustrative example of another EU Horizon project, which we did. There was another ENFASYS partner also involved together with us in the project. The project was about sustainable and resilient farming systems. The project ran from 2017 to 2021. We had a lot of output, policy briefs, events, everything which is usually involved in the EU Horizon project. But none less than 2023, 2024, like 2-3 years after the project, I still got questions, for instance, from people working in the governmental agency of agriculture in Belgium that had been reading output from that project from 2-3 years earlier and had additional questions about it because they were in the process of thinking about new policies, new instruments, and they still had questions about it. So the legacy can sometimes with a project, your project timing does not always fit policy timing. There are policy circles, policy timing. So a legacy has to be continued. And what we have learned in ENFASYS, we should not just stop communicating and disseminating that when the project ends or even 6 months after the project ends, but we should continue using that.
I now have a very hypothetical question. But if you were asked to create a new project with a similar objective as ENFASYS, let's say support the shift to more sustainable agriculture in Europe, but now you have the results from the ENFASYS project. What would this project be about, and what do you think should be used from the ENFASYS project? Let's say it like that.
Well, that could go different directions. I have I think actually think it's a good characteristic as a researcher that I'm interested in a lot of things and in a lot of different types of projects. Of course, it can also work to your disadvantage. That you are engaged in too much different things. But yeah, one thing that I have seen, that I've learned now from ENFASYS, especially ENFASYS, but also a few other projects, has to do with the concept that I introduced earlier about the congruence. The way instruments are fine-tuned and how the instruments together with the objectives can support each other in moving towards more sustainability. I know there is a lot to do in improving not the instruments, not the choice of instruments, not even the mix of instruments, but just how each individual instrument is fine-tuned. We have seen in most of our case studies that very often the instruments are there, but the way they are fine-tuned, it leaves a lot of potential unharvested, a lot of potential to move agri-food systems, to move individual farmers, but sectors as a whole towards more sustainability. That is not an easy task because a lot of that is in the detail, and the detail is often country, sector specific. So that would mean a lot of individual studies, a lot of individual experiments. Not always easy to do in a European project, but that's definitely something that I would like to do in the future, based on what I have learned from ENFASYS, like looking at individual instruments, and of course not just at individual instruments. Individual instruments need to be optimized, taking into account the other instruments that are there. Sometimes instruments can reinforce each other. They can also compensate each other, whereby two instruments together, they kind of cause a standstill rather than a move towards more sustainability. And then that would be a project or a large number of projects in many different countries that I would be very interested to do. And then another thing that I'm based on, especially ENFASYS, but also some other projects that I'm very interested in elaborating further, is kind of the paradox a bit between in ENFASYS. We are really convinced that procedural justice, procedural transparency, co-creation of policies, participation of everyone affected in policies is important. Policy making should be open. It should be participatory. It should involve the participation of everyone who could potentially be affected. That has to do with the policy trust and reliability as a design principle, which I said earlier. But at the same time, in ENFASYS, we have seen that by doing that, you potentially give ample way for policies to reflect the interests of certain groups on the one hand, and second, for policy mixes or policy instruments that are proposed to reflect the lock-ins that people are in, whereby you actually reinforce those lock-ins. Sometimes people have been so long in cultural, technical, social lock-ins that when involving them in the policy design process, they kind of confirm the existing lock-ins. And the result of the participatory design process is policies that don't necessarily unlock the lock-ins, but they kind of take these lock-ins as boundaries within which some incremental changes can be done. And that paradox where we are still convinced that policy making should be open, transparent, procedurally just, involve the participation of many people, but whereby at the same time you see that if you do that, you run into the risk of, on the one hand, confirming existing lock-ins and not going further than some incremental changes rather than very transformative changes. Plus, you run into the risk of giving ample way of interest groups to influence. I don't want to use the word lobby, but I'm doing it anyway, to influence what the eventual policies are and how to reconcile this paradox that I have seen.
Thank you very much, Erwin.
I would not know how to investigate that, but that's really something that's based on ENFASYS is now consuming a lot of my thoughts, actually, on how to do that better in the future.
Yes, this is very insightful, and who knows if we have more podcast episodes in the future, maybe what you're discussing now, it will actually be a research project, and we will have the answer to the how to do that. But for now, I would really like to thank you a lot for this insightful discussion. I think it was very interesting and a good way to close the podcast series for the ENFASYS project, hoping that we will have more episodes on similar topics in the future. Thank you very much, Erwin.
Thanks so much, Davide.